In the dark annals of human history, few chapters evoke the same level of horror and disbelief as what unfolded in the frozen plains of Manchuria between 1937 and 1945. While the world would come to know the horrors of Auschwitz and the crimes of Nazi doctors, another program of systematic human experimentation was taking place thousands of miles to the east, one that would kill tens of thousands and yet escape the justice that befell its European counterparts. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. In Nuremberg, Nazi doctors who had treated human beings as laboratory specimens found themselves standing before tribunals. Generals who had ordered mass executions met the hangman's rope. The world, it seemed, had decided that some crimes could not be buried alongside the dead. Yet in Manchuria, something else was happening entirely. An entire complex was burning. Buildings that had once housed laboratories, operating theaters, and prison cells were reduced to ash. Documents recording years of meticulous horror were fed into flames, and prisoners, those who had survived long enough to witness the empire's collapse, were silenced permanently before any liberating army could hear their testimony. The men responsible for this destruction did not flee into the shadows like common criminals. They boarded trains. They returned to Japan. Some resumed medical careers. Others became university professors, pharmaceutical executives, and respected members of society. No trials awaited them. No prosecutor summoned them. No gallows cast shadows over their futures. In Nuremberg, Josef Mengelé's colleagues faced justice for experiments that killed thousands. In Tokyo, men who had orchestrated experiments killing tens of thousands received something else entirely: protection. How did one of the most extensive human experimentation programs in history vanish without a single courtroom? How did doctors who had deliberately infected prisoners with plague, who had frozen limbs to observe frostbite progression, who had operated on conscious human beings without anesthesia, how did these men escape the reckoning that consumed their German counterparts? The answer lies not in the chaos of war, but in the cold calculations of peace. To understand what disappeared in those burning buildings, we must first understand what had been built within them. Located in Pingfang, a district near Harbin in Japanese-occupied Manchuria, Unit 731 was not a laboratory in any conventional sense. It was not a single facility operated by rogue scientists pursuing forbidden knowledge in secret. It was something far more disturbing, a military-industrial complex dedicated to biological warfare, staffed by approximately 3,000 personnel, spanning over 150 buildings, and capable of holding hundreds of prisoners at any given time. Its official name was the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. The title was deliberately mundane, bureaucratic, forgettable. Water purification suggested public health initiatives. Epidemic prevention implied protective medicine. The language of healing concealed the architecture of death. From the air, the Pingfang complex might have resembled any military installation: administrative buildings, barracks, power stations, railways connecting to the broader infrastructure of empire. But at its center stood structures that served no conventional military purpose: laboratories designed for the mass production of pathogens, facilities for testing those pathogens on living subjects, and crematoria for disposing of the evidence. This was not a rogue operation run by madmen on the margins of military authority. Unit 731 received direct funding from the Japanese Imperial Army. Its commander, Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, reported to the highest levels of military leadership. Its research priorities aligned with strategic objectives: developing biological weapons that could be deployed against Chinese forces, Soviet armies, and potentially American troops. The scale of organization defied the popular image of wartime atrocities as chaotic excess. Unit 731 employed microbiologists, surgeons, engineers, veterinarians, and pharmacologists. It maintained its own power plant, its own airfield, its own railway spur, Administrative staff tracked supplies and personnel. Accountants managed budgets. In the words of one historian who has studied the program extensively, this was not a rogue lab. It was a factory of death staffed by officers, engineers, surgeons, and accountants. The machinery of modern institutional management was applied with bureaucratic precision to the production of suffering, and Unit 731 was merely the largest node in a broader network. Satellite facilities operated across Manchuria and occupied China. Branch units conducted similar research in Nanjing, Changchun, and other locations. The biological warfare program extended far beyond a single installation. It was a system, coordinated and deliberate, woven into the fabric of Japan's military occupation. The prisoners arrived through a system as methodical as any other military logistics operation. The Kenpei Tai, Japan's military police force, served as the primary procurement mechanism. Across occupied Manchuria and China, they gathered human beings who would never be seen again. The categories were broad enough to encompass almost anyone: suspected resistance members, communist sympathizers, common criminals, and civilians who had simply been in the wrong place during a security sweep. Chinese men and women formed the majority of subjects. Korean prisoners arrived as Japan's colonial reach extended across the peninsula. Soviet citizens captured during border skirmishes filled cells alongside them. Some accounts describe Allied prisoners of war, Americans, British, Australians, though the full extent of their use remains contested among historians. These people were not criminals in any meaningful sense. Their imprisonment resulted not from trials or verdicts, but from military convenience. A farmer might be arrested on suspicion of aiding guerrillas. A student might disappear after being seen with banned literature. A woman might be taken simply because a certain number of female subjects were required for specific experiments. The internal terminology of Unit 731 revealed everything about how the institution regarded its victims. Prisoners were called maruta, logs. The word was not metaphorical, it was administrative. When personnel discussed the transfer of logs, they meant human beings. When requisition formed specified numbers of logs, they specified lives to be consumed. The linguistic dehumanization served a psychological function. It allowed doctors who had taken oaths to heal scientists who had dedicated careers to understanding biology, ordinary young men conscripted into military service. It allowed all of them to participate in systematic horror while maintaining some internal narrative of professional detachment. In the haunting words of one former Unit 731 member who testified decades later, "We thought of them as logs, not as human beings. That made it easier. They were not studying patients. They were processing material. And the processing was thorough. Once prisoners entered Unit 731, they did not leave. No releases occurred, no paroles were granted. The facility's purpose required absolute containment, not merely to prevent escape, but to prevent any survivor from ever describing what happened within those walls. The experiments conducted at Unit 731 were not designed to advance medical knowledge in any conventional sense. They were designed to answer specific questions of military utility. How quickly does plague kill? What is the optimal delivery mechanism for anthrax? How does the human body respond to extreme cold? And at what point does tissue damage become irreversible? Deliberate infection formed the core of the research program. Prisoners were exposed to pathogens through multiple vectors. Some were injected directly with cultures of deadly bacteria. Others inhaled aerosolized pathogens in sealed chambers. Still others consumed contaminated food or water, their bodies becoming testing grounds for the efficiency of various delivery methods. The diseases employed read like a catalog of humanity's worst microbial enemies: bubonic plague, cholera, typhoid, anthrax, tuberculosis, dysentery. Each pathogen was studied not for the purpose of treatment, but for the purpose of weaponization. Researchers did not simply infect and observe. They tracked progression with clinical detachment documenting symptoms at each stage, measuring vital signs as bodies failed, and conducting autopsies, sometimes before death had fully occurred, to examine organ damage in real time. Vivisection without anesthesia became routine within the walls of Unit 731. The stated rationale was scientific. Anesthesia might affect tissue samples and compromise data. The practical reality was that conscious human beings were cut open, their organs examined while still functioning, their suffering recorded as experimental observation. One former Unit 731 member, speaking decades later under condition of anonymity, described the procedures in chilling terms. They would scream at first, but eventually they stopped. We would remove organs one by one, examining them while the heart was still beating. That was considered the most valuable data. Exposure experiments extended beyond disease. Prisoners were subjected to extreme cold to study frostbite progression. Research that held particular interest for military planners concerned about combat in Manchurian winters. Limbs were frozen, thawed, and frozen again to determine the limits of tissue recovery. Others were placed in pressure chambers to observe the effects of rapid decompression. Some were subjected to centrifuges until their bodies could no longer withstand the force. The goal was always military application, understanding how soldiers might survive or how enemies might die under various battlefield conditions. Field testing carried the research beyond laboratory walls. Biological weapons were deployed against Chinese cities and villages. Plague-infected fleas were released from aircraft over populated areas. Water supplies were contaminated with cholera and typhoid. The civilian populations below became unwitting subjects in experiments too large for any laboratory to contain. They were not studying disease, one must understand. They were studying how fast a human body collapses. The precision of documentation underscored the institutional nature of the horror. Experiments were recorded in detail. Data was compiled and analyzed. Reports were written, reviewed, and filed. The apparatus of scientific methodology was maintained even as its subjects screamed. No survivors emerged from Unit 731's experimental programs. This was policy, not accident. Living witnesses would constitute evidence. The system required their elimination as surely as it required their initial procurement. August 1945 transformed the strategic calculus of the Japanese Empire overnight. The Soviet declaration of war on August 8th sent Red Army forces pouring into Manchuria with devastating speed. Within days, the defensive positions that Japan had spent years constructing began to collapse. The atomic destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki made clear that continued resistance would bring only annihilation. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast that marked the end of an empire. For Unit 731's leadership, the end of the war presented a singular and urgent problem: evidence. The facility contained years of documentation, research notes, experimental logs, photographs, autopsy reports, administrative records that traced the full scope of the program. It held specimens and samples. Most critically, it held prisoners who could testify to what had been done to them. Shiro Ishii, the man who had built Unit 731 into the largest biological warfare program in history, ordered the destruction of everything. The demolition was systematic and thorough. Buildings were dynamited. Laboratories were set ablaze. Documents were fed into furnaces or buried in pits that would never be excavated. The remaining prisoners, those who had survived ongoing experimentation long enough to reach that August, were killed and their bodies incinerated in the crematoria that had consumed so many before them. Staff received instructions for their own dispersal. They were to return to Japan by various routes, avoiding capture by Soviet forces at all costs. They were to maintain absolute silence about their work, never speaking of what had occurred at Pingfang. They were given cover stories about water purification and epidemic prevention. The official fiction that had always shielded the unit's true purpose. It was not retreat, one must recognize. It was an evidence purge. The destruction was remarkably effective. By the time Soviet forces reached Pingfang, they found ruins rather than a functioning installation. Some evidence remained. The physical infrastructure could not be completely erased, and local Chinese witnesses provided accounts of what they had observed from outside the compound walls. But the documentary record that might have supported comprehensive war crimes prosecutions had largely been eliminated. The men of Unit 731 scattered across Japan like seeds in the wind, their knowledge intact, their testimony locked behind walls of military loyalty and self-preservation. They possessed something that would soon become valuable to interests far removed from justice: data. The American occupation of Japan began with multiple, sometimes conflicting objectives that would shape the fate of Unit 731's perpetrators. General Douglas MacArthur, supreme commander for the Allied powers, assumed authority over a defeated nation in September 1945. Among its responsibilities was the prosecution of war crimes. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, Tokyo's equivalent of Nuremberg, would try Japanese military and civilian leaders for crimes against peace and crimes against humanity. War crimes investigators began gathering evidence with determination. They interviewed witnesses, examined documents, and traced the institutional structures that had enabled Japanese atrocities across Asia. The biological warfare program was known to American intelligence. Reports of its existence had circulated during the war, and the nature of its work was no mystery. But within the occupation authority, another interest was at work, one that operated in shadows rather than courtrooms. Military intelligence, specifically the G2 section under Major General Charles Willoughby, pursued priorities that differed sharply from those of the prosecutors. The Cold War was not yet formally underway, but its contours were already visible to those who looked. The Soviet Union, America's ally against fascism, was rapidly becoming its rival. The Red Army occupied Manchuria and had captured some Unit 731 personnel. Whatever biological warfare knowledge the Soviets might extract from those prisoners represented a potential threat to American security. American intelligence faced a question that would define the moral legacy of the occupation. What did Unit 731 actually know? The Japanese biological warfare program had been operational for over a decade. It had conducted research that no American institution could legally perform: human experimentation without consent, without ethical review, without any of the constraints that governed Western medical research. Whatever knowledge had been gained through those methods might, in the emerging calculus of Cold War competition, prove strategically valuable. Two bureaucratic imperatives collided within the halls of occupied Tokyo. War crimes prosecutors sought justice for victims and accountability for perpetrators. Intelligence officers sought information that might provide military advantage against the Soviets. Both operated under the authority of the American occupation, but their objectives were not merely different, they were mutually exclusive. If Unit 731's researchers were prosecuted, their knowledge would become evidence in a public trial, available to any nation that wished to examine it. If they were protected, their knowledge could be acquired in secret, kept from Soviet hands, and potentially used to advance American biological warfare capabilities. The choice, when it came, would sacrifice justice on the altar of strategy. The negotiations that followed left no proud legacy for those who conducted them. Between 1947 and 1948, American military intelligence pursued a systematic arrangement with the surviving leadership of Unit 731. The terms were devastatingly simple: data in exchange for immunity. Researchers would provide complete information about their biological warfare work, the pathogens they had developed, the delivery mechanisms they had tested, the results they had obtained from experiments on human subjects. In return, they would face no prosecution, suffer no punishment, and receive protection from any other authority, including the Soviets, that might seek to hold them accountable. General Charles Willoughby, MacArthur's intelligence chief, oversaw the arrangement with cold efficiency. Willoughby was an ardent anti-communist who viewed the emerging Soviet threat as the paramount concern of American strategy. Japanese war criminals, in his assessment, mattered less than Japanese intelligence assets. The past, however horrific, could be sacrificed for advantage in the future. The payments were modest by military standards. Between 150,000 and 200,000 yen flowed to former Unit 731 personnel. Food, supplies, and material support supplemented the cash. For men who might otherwise have faced execution, the compensation was secondary to the immunity itself. What did America receive in return? Documents and reports arrived at Camp Detrick, the U.S. Army's Biological Warfare Research Center in Maryland. Researchers debriefed former Unit 731 scientists in extensive interviews, extracting details of experiments that American ethics would never have permitted. Data on pathogen production, delivery mechanisms, and human susceptibility, data derived from experiments conducted on living prisoners, entered American military archives classified at the highest levels. The transaction was bureaucratic, procedural, and entirely hidden from public view. No announcement was made, no justification was offered. The men who had presided over the deaths of thousands simply faded into respectable civilian life, their crimes erased by the signature on a classified memorandum. The price of silence was cheaper than a single bomber. Shiroishi himself received protection. The man who had commanded the entire biological warfare network, who had authorized experiments that killed thousands upon thousands, who had ordered the evidence destruction in August 1945, this man was never charged with any crime. He returned to civilian life, consulted periodically with American intelligence, and died of natural causes in 1959, surrounded by family rather than prison walls. His subordinates enjoyed similar outcomes. Medical researchers who had conducted vivisections on conscious prisoners became pharmaceutical executives at major Japanese companies. Scientists who had deliberately infected children with plague joined university faculties and trained the next generation of doctors. The skills developed at Pingfang found application in post-war careers that brought wealth and respect. The bargain had no moral dimension whatsoever. It was purely transactional. Knowledge exchanged for impunity, intelligence weighed against justice, strategic calculation substituted for ethical accountability. The formal justification arrived through proper bureaucratic channels, as such decisions always do. The State War Navy Coordinating Committee, the interagency body that coordinated occupation policy, issued guidance on the disposition of Japanese biological warfare information. The decision was framed in terms of national interest, wrapped in the language of strategic necessity. The data possessed by Unit 731 researchers had potential military value. Prosecution would require disclosure of that data in public proceedings. Such disclosure might benefit adversaries, particularly the Soviet Union. Therefore, prosecution was not in the national interest. The logic was circular but bureaucratically unassailable. The very crimes that made prosecution morally imperative also made prosecution strategically inconvenient. Experiments conducted on human beings without consent had produced knowledge that American researchers could not legally obtain. That knowledge, however contaminated its origins, might prove useful in developing American biological warfare capabilities or defenses. Sharing it through public trials would sacrifice the advantage. By 1948, the decision was formalized in classified memoranda that would remain hidden for decades. All information related to Japanese biological warfare research was classified at the highest levels. All pursuit of prosecution was terminated. The men of Unit 731 were officially beyond the reach of justice, protected not by their own power, but by the power of the nation that had defeated them. The reasoning reflected a broader pattern of Cold War decision-making that would recur again and again. Former enemies became potential allies. Former allies became potential enemies. The moral clarity of wartime, when Nazi doctors and Japanese militarists represented unambiguous evil, gave way to the strategic ambiguity of great power competition. Knowledge, regardless of how it was obtained, became a commodity. Its possessors became assets to be cultivated rather than criminals to be punished. The victims of Unit 731, the Chinese farmers, the Korean laborers, the Soviet prisoners, all the human beings who had been reduced to logs, in administrative terminology, disappeared from the calculation entirely. Their suffering had produced data. That data now belonged to the American military. Justice for the dead was weighed against advantage for the living, and advantage won. In December 1949, the Soviet Union conducted what the Americans would not. The Khabarovsk war crimes trial brought 12 Japanese military personnel before a Soviet military tribunal, in a proceeding that would be dismissed by the West as propaganda, but would prove to be something more. The defendants were not senior commanders. Most of Unit 731's leadership had escaped to American-occupied Japan before the Soviets could reach them. But they were participants in the biological warfare program. They could testify to what had occurred. The charges were explicit and damning: preparation and use of biological weapons, human experimentation, mass murder of prisoners and civilians alike. Soviet prosecutors presented evidence gathered from Manchuria, from captured documents that had escaped destruction, and from the defendants' own admissions. The proceedings were public, translated into multiple languages, and distributed as propaganda to the global press. American authorities immediately dismissed the trial as a communist spectacle designed to embarrass the United States and distract from Soviet crimes. The State Department characterized it as propaganda rather than justice. Western media largely followed this framing, treating Khabarovsk as evidence of Soviet dishonesty rather than Japanese atrocity. The Cold War had rendered truth itself contested territory. Yet the testimony at Khabarovsk was remarkable in its detail and consistency. Defendants described the Pingfang facility in terms that matched its physical layout. They outlined experimental programs that aligned with what American intelligence already knew from its own secret debriefings of Unit 731 personnel. They named victims, described methods, and confessed to participation in crimes that would have warranted execution at Nuremberg. The propaganda framework did not erase the factual content of what was revealed. Modern historians, examining the Khabarovsk transcripts decades later, with access to documents from multiple archives, have reached an uncomfortable conclusion. The trial was largely accurate. Its procedural flaws, the absence of defense counsel, the predetermined verdicts, the obvious political staging, did not negate the evidentiary substance. Soviet prosecutors had documented real crimes, even if their motives were not purely judicial. The Khabarovsk defendants received sentences ranging from 2 to 25 years in Soviet labor camps. They served their terms in the frozen gulags of Siberia. Upon release, several returned to Japan, where they faced no further prosecution from authorities who had already decided to bury the past. The trial had broken the silence, but it had not delivered justice. The Soviets had tried low-ranking participants, while the Americans protected the architects. Between the two powers, the full scope of Unit 731's crimes remained officially unaddressed. Decades later, an essential question emerged from the classified files. Was the data worth anything at all? American scientists at Camp Detrick reviewed the materials obtained from Unit 731 with professional interest bordering on eagerness. Here was information derived from experiments no Western institution could conduct: systematic human infection studies, detailed autopsy reports on disease progression, controlled exposure to pathogens under varying conditions without the ethical constraints that limited American research. The potential value seemed obvious. The assessment that followed was deflating in the extreme. Camp Detrick researchers found the data scientifically limited in ways that undermined its strategic value. Experimental methodology was often crude by Western standards. Sample sizes were inconsistent and poorly controlled. Experimental conditions were inadequately documented. The Japanese researchers had prioritized military application over scientific rigor, producing results that answered operational questions but contributed little to fundamental understanding of disease mechanisms. More significantly, much of what Unit 731 had discovered through human experimentation was already known through ethical research conducted over decades. The progression of untreated plague was documented in historical records stretching back centuries. The effects of extreme cold on human tissue were understood from clinical observations of frostbite victims. The Japanese data added detail in some areas, but rarely added knowledge that could not have been obtained and in many cases had not already been obtained through legitimate medical research. The immunity granted to Unit 731 personnel had purchased, in scientific terms, almost nothing of lasting value. This revelation, when it gradually became public decades later through declassified documents and investigative journalism, added another layer to the moral catastrophe. The bargain had not merely sacrificed justice for intelligence advantage. It had sacrificed justice for intelligence advantage that proved largely illusory. Thousands of victims had been denied acknowledgement. Their killers had been protected and allowed to prosper. And the strategic justification for that protection, the valuable data that could not be obtained any other way, had been hollow from the beginning. The transaction had consumed its moral cost and delivered minimal return. In the cold calculus of history, the bargain was not merely wrong, it was pointless. For decades, Unit 731 remained what its destroyers had intended, a gap in official history, a silence where accountability should have been. Japanese government records made no mention of the biological warfare program. School curricula omitted it entirely. Veterans who had served at Pingfang maintained their silence, honoring wartime instructions that had never been rescinded, even as the empire that issued them crumbled to dust. The American classification of related materials ensured that documentary evidence remained inaccessible to researchers and journalists alike. Then, slowly, the silence began to erode. In 1984, a Japanese journalist named Moromura Seiichi published a detailed account of Unit 731 based on interviews with surviving participants who had finally decided to speak. The book sparked public controversy in Japan, forcing an acknowledgement, however contested and qualified, that something had occurred at Pingfang. Chinese survivors and witnesses, long ignored by the international community, began to have their testimonies recorded by researchers who traveled to the villages where biological weapons had been deployed. Historians in multiple countries assembled fragmentary evidence into coherent narratives. Documentary filmmakers brought visual attention to sites that had been forgotten. The Japanese government's response remained evasive for years, acknowledging bits of the truth while refusing to accept full responsibility. Acknowledgement came in fragments, often qualified, rarely accompanied by formal apology or meaningful compensation for victims or their families. Then, in 2018, Japan's National Archives released a significant document that changed the evidentiary landscape: a roster of Unit 731 personnel. The list contained thousands of names, doctors, researchers, support staff, administrators who had made the machinery of death function smoothly. For the first time, the institutional scale of the program was officially documented by Japanese authorities themselves. The names revealed something important about the nature of the crime. Participation in Unit 731 was not confined to a small cadre of fanatics operating at the margins of Japanese medicine. It encompassed a broad segment of Japan's medical and scientific establishment. The crimes had been committed not by outliers, but by the professional mainstream. Further archival releases in 2025 revealed additional facilities, additional programs, additional personnel whose participation had never been documented. Each disclosure expanded the proven scope of the biological warfare network, confirming what survivors had claimed for decades. The crime was bigger than anyone admitted. Any honest accounting of Unit 731 must distinguish between established facts, contested claims, and permanent uncertainties that may never be resolved. Certain matters are documented beyond reasonable dispute by evidence from multiple independent sources. The existence of Unit 731 and its network of satellite facilities is confirmed by Japanese, American, Chinese, and Soviet archives. The use of prisoners for lethal experimentation is attested by confessions from participants, testimony from Chinese witnesses, physical remains at the Pingfang site, and declassified American intelligence documents. The post-war immunity arrangement is documented in U.S. government archives that have since been partially declassified. Other matters remain subject to scholarly debate and may never be definitively settled. The precise number of victims is unknown and perhaps unknowable. Estimates range from 3,000 to over 10,000 for Unit 731 alone, with additional casualties from satellite facilities and field operations, pushing the total higher. The destruction of records in August 1945 eliminated the documentation that might have provided definitive figures. The scope of field testing, biological weapons deployed against Chinese populations, is established in general terms, but difficult to quantify precisely. Epidemic outbreaks in areas targeted by Unit 731 operations killed unknown numbers of civilians, but distinguishing deliberately caused infections from naturally occurring disease presents methodological challenges that historians continue to grapple with. The identities and fates of individual victims are, in most cases, permanently lost to history. Chinese and Korean prisoners were not identified by name in the surviving records. They entered Unit 731 as anonymous logs and disappeared without trace. Their families, in many cases, never learned what happened to them, spending decades wondering about loved ones who simply vanished. Certain claims circulated about Unit 731 exceed the available evidence and must be treated with appropriate caution. Specific experimental procedures, sometimes described in popular accounts, lack documentary confirmation. The tendency to focus on the most sensational alleged practices can distort understanding of what is actually proven. The records are missing because they were deliberately destroyed. This was not historical accident or archival neglect or the chaos of war. It was intentional elimination of evidence by perpetrators who understood that documentation would enable prosecution. The gaps in the historical record are themselves evidence of the crime and the consciousness of guilt that accompanied it. The story of Unit 731 is not primarily a story of Japanese atrocity, though atrocity there certainly was. It is a story of systems that enabled horror, and systems that protected those who committed it. The Imperial Japanese military created an institutional structure for biological warfare research that operated with bureaucratic efficiency. That structure required human subjects. It acquired them through the machinery of military occupation. It processed them through a system that recorded experiments, tracked results, and disposed of evidence with the same organizational precision that characterized any industrial operation. The destruction of that structure in August 1945 was itself systematic, an organized effort to eliminate accountability before the victors arrived. Then a second system intervened with equally devastating effect. American military intelligence assessed the situation through the lens of strategic competition rather than moral accountability. It identified valuable assets, men with knowledge, data with potential applications, and structured an arrangement to acquire them. War crimes prosecution in this calculation represented a cost rather than an objective. The decision to protect Unit 731's perpetrators was not made by rogue officers operating outside proper authority. It was made through bureaucratic channels, approved at senior levels, documented in memoranda, and implemented as policy. The system that enabled the cover-up was as institutional as the system that had enabled the crimes themselves. At Nuremberg, Nazi doctors faced judgment because Allied authorities determined that justice required it. At Tokyo, Japanese doctors escaped judgment because American authorities determined that strategy precluded it. The difference lay not in the nature of the crimes, which were comparable in their horror, but in the priorities of the victors who held the power to prosecute. What lessons survived this collapse of moral consistency? The victims of Unit 731 received no courtroom vindication. Their suffering was not acknowledged in official proceedings that might have established a historical record. Their killers were not made to answer for what they had done. The compensation of justice was denied them. Yet their memory persists against all efforts to erase it. The gradual disclosure of Unit 731's crimes through journalism, historical research, archival releases, and survivor testimony has constructed a record that official proceedings never created. The truth has emerged not through institutions of justice, but despite their failure. As Elie Wiesel, reflecting on a different set of atrocities in a different continent, once observed, "To forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time." The victims of Unit 731 were killed once by Japanese military researchers who saw them as nothing more than raw material for experimentation. They were erased once by the evidence destruction of August 1945. They were threatened with a third death, the death of forgetting, by the silence that followed, maintained by perpetrators and protectors alike. Memory resists that final erasure with stubborn persistence. The names of the perpetrators are now known and recorded in official archives. The scope of the program has been documented by historians across multiple nations. The immunity bargain has been exposed and its hollowness revealed. The historical record, though incomplete, is no longer empty. In the words of philosopher George Santayana, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Justice was not served for the victims of Unit 731. The courtrooms that should have held their killers accountable remained empty. The gallows that should have awaited the architects of their suffering were never built. But memory refuses to yield to the convenience of forgetting. And in that refusal lies a form of justice that no government bargain can entirely extinguish.